What's up, my Canadian cousins? Welcome back. So I'm going to return to history after departing from it to do some cultural and music and geography. This reaction relates to the United States Civil War and Canadians who fought in the war. Now, this is only something I've learned since doing this channel. I do know that the American Civil War certainly interrelates in a very big way to Canadian history because it was one of the catalysts to Confederation for when it happened. Of course, Canada was not yet confederated when the Civil War ended in 1865, but it was only 2 short years later that happened. There were fears that the United States would try to annex Canada in the wake of the Civil War, and there were tensions between the British Empire and the United States as a result of the Civil War. The Trent Affair, HMS Trent, was a British ship in which the United States Navy, in the midst of its blockade of the southern states, caught Confederate diplomats on a British ship. Britain was seriously toying with supporting the Confederacy and recognizing it. And of course, as a result of the Trent Affair and the capture of those diplomats, eventually under British demands, Lincoln let them go. He did not want to risk war with Great Britain, and some troops were sent from Britain to Nova Scotia, I believe in Halifax. So there were tensions as a result of the war. I think the majority of Canadians sympathized with the North, but there were elites, and I've read about this since learning somewhat about it as a result of reactions to this channel, and whenever I whet my appetite with something, I need to read more about it, so I have since then. And there were a lot of Canadian business elites that were hurt by the blockade. Certainly Britain wanted its cotton trade to continue from the South, and there were, attitudes among the elite at the time that they sympathized with this sort of aristocratic societal structure that was prevalent in the South as compared to the North, and frankly didn't much care about the slavery issue. But I think as far as the common person goes, the support for the Northern cause was far greater. We all know what Canadians did as part of the network of the Underground Railroad to help runaway slaves gain their freedom without fear of Southern bounty hunters coming back into the North and legally being able to take them back to the South under the Fugitive Slave Act, etc., etc. Beyond that, I don't really know much about who fought in the war and why from north of our border, and I would like to know more about that. So that's what we're going to explore today, my friends. And let's get to the video, and I hope you enjoy it. I will see you on the flip side.
Hi everyone, today we're talking about Canada and the American Civil War. The American Civil War lasted from 1861 to 1865, and Canada wouldn't officially exist as a federation for another 2 years, in 1867. However, the building blocks for Canada existed. This included the province of Canada, the maritime colonies, British Columbia, Vancouver Island, and Crown territory administered by the Hudson Bay Company, called Rupert's Land. These were British colonies during the American Civil War, but had their own identities. These colonies, like Britain, would remain neutral, but there were tensions. Despite neutrality, Canadians largely supported the Union. Slavery had been completely abolished in Canada by 1834. Some 40,000 American slaves, many from the South, escaped to Canada before the Civil War and brought with them a disdain for the southern states. The northern states had the benefit of cultural and economic ties with Canada. As such, many Canadians, or British North Americans, upwards to 55,000 men, enlisted to fight for the Union. Though some men fought for the South, and some Canadian churches and occasionally the press supported the right for independence and self-governance of the South. Back in Britain, there were even politicians who supported the Confederacy. However, they were few, as Washington warned Britain. Support of the South could lead to war, and Britain didn't want to risk a fledgling Canada being invaded by the US.
Wow, 55,000 troops. I want to hear a little bit more about that. I think it was more than a few British people that, or those in power and those in power economically supported the South. The cotton trade was very big for the British mercantile textile trade, and they were severely missing their cotton. They doubted the North's ability to prevail in the fight, and ultimately thought, especially with some early military victories by the South, that it was inevitable, and toyed with recognizing them. It wasn't until the Emancipation Proclamation, and by the way, Queen Victoria had read Uncle Tom's Cabin and was appalled by the institution of slavery and was very affected by that book. And, although the British only 30 years before had abolished slavery in the empire, it's not like it had been abolished for a century. It wasn't all that long before. But there was no slavery on the British Isles for a very long time, and a lot of colonies didn't have it. And Britain became a sort of stalwart in trying to, I guess, redress the wrong that it perpetrated in the slave trade, starting the African slave trade to the Americas, really, in the first place. But so it was complicated. When the North had some victories, and Lincoln knew he had the clout at that point, based on turning the tide of the war somewhat, to emancipate the slaves in the southern colonies should the North prevail in the war. He finally did so, and he did so for moral reasons, to be sure, but also to dissuade Britain from supporting the South in any way, because now the war was officially declared to be about slavery. It made it completely untenable for the British to support the South in any real way.
The first major test between Canada and the US was in November of 1861 during the Trent Affair. An American warship stopped the British mail ship RMS Trent, seizing 2 Confederate diplomats. The British, obsessed with naval dominance and freedom, took this seriously. They demanded the return of the diplomats and sent 14,000 combat troops to Canada and the Maritimes. Further plans were drafted in Canada to raise 40.
So yeah, I was talking to you about that in generalization. 14,000 is a lot, especially for back then.
1,000 militia. Lincoln released the diplomats and famously cautioned his Secretary of State, William H. Seward, one war at a time. Tension remained. In 1862, the Grand Trunk Railway Brigade was formed, a unit of Canadian volunteer militia, who were also railway employees. Their main responsibility was to protect Canada's vital railway lines. Despite only sharing a border with the North, Canada did see Confederate activity. Maritimers were particularly sympathetic to the South, as many desired their own independence. Confederate blockade runners often found aid in Halifax. In December of 1863, a Union tug, the Chesapeake, was captured by Confederate sympathizers from the Maritimes, who planned to take it.
So that's interesting, and that's a part of the story I didn't really know, as to reasoning why some British North Americans supported the Confederacy. And he's saying that, some in the Maritimes were wanting independence themselves from Britain, I suppose, and saw a sympathetic cause down south of the border that they could relate to.
Take it south to North Carolina. However, it was overtaken by Union ships in the waters of Nova Scotia. The ship was escorted to Halifax and eventually returned to the Union, but the Confederate sympathizers escaped with the help of locals, much to the anger of the American government. On the mainland, the Confederacy attempted to establish an intelligence operation in Canada, based in Montreal. In October of 1864, Confederate agents crossed the border and robbed 3 banks in St. Albans, Vermont, killing a U.S. citizen and escaping with $170,000. The Union pursued them across the Canadian border, creating an international incident. The Canadians eventually arrested the Confederate raiders. A Canadian court ruled that because they were soldiers under military orders, officially neutral Canada could not extradite them. Amazingly, Canada freed the raiders, but returned what money was found. The raid turned many Canadians against the Confederacy. The Confederate agents in Canada realized this, and no further raids were made. Ultimately, the American Civil War boosted Canada's economy. The Union bought up significant Canadian food and manufactured goods to support their armies. The tension between the US and Britain further expedited the need for a united Canada. The Dominion of Canada was formed on July 1st, 1867, only 2 years and 3 months after the end of the American Civil War. The Civil War was also a lesson in too much decentralized power for the founding fathers of the Canadian Confederation, and inspired Canadian government checks and balances, including the appointed Senate and British-appointed Governor-General. Alright, I'm Johnny. Thanks for watching this little brief on Canada and America's Civil War. If you want to support the channel, you know what to do. Like, sub, and I hope to see you next time.
Thank you, Johnny, from John. Yes, I will drop a link in the description for him, so do support him. And that was very informative. I think that last point was something I was making before. I'd also say that I learned that the Canadian Pacific Railway was thought to be an imperative also because of, in the aftermath of the Civil War, there was the idea of, of course, manifest destiny, and there was concern that the United States would try to annex the western part of Canada. There was a need to join British Columbia with the East and to really develop the rest of the western part of Canada. The railway was essential, and so the imperative to get that done as the imperative to confederate were both in large part out of concerns for what the United States might do. Yeah, so that was good. It was short also, and I'm going to look at another video now, so please stick with me, which is, I think, going to go into a little bit more about, the soldiers themselves that fought and who they were. Let's take a look and, stay with me.
Throughout the 19th century, Canadians fought on countless foreign battlefields. Less well known are the stories of many Canadians who fought south of the border during the American Civil War. Between 1861 and 1865, Americans fought a bloody conflict which pitted the Union troops from the north against the Confederate troops from the south. More than 3 million Americans served in the Union and Confederate armies. Of those, approximately 600,000 lost their lives to combat, wounds sustained in battle, or disease. During the 1860s, Canada as a nation was still in its infancy, and Canadian attitudes with respect to the Civil War were complex. The British government had abolished slavery across its empire in 1834. The popular Canadian sentiment opposed the continued practice in the United States. Tens of thousands of Canadians crossed the border to fight in the conflict. While exact numbers are unknown, it is estimated that between 35,000 and 50,000 Canadians and Maritimers took up arms in the American Civil War. While the majority donned the Union blue uniform, some chose to fight for the Confederate side and wore the gray uniform. Canadian reasons for participating in the struggle included the belief in the cause, a desire for adventure or money, and victimization at the hands of ruthless recruiters. At the end of the war, many Canadians had become...
That last one is interesting. I hadn't thought of that. I guess certain of them were maybe tricked into it or promised things that couldn't be delivered.
Officers, and 29 had won the highest military honor in the United States, the Congressional Medal of Honor.
Wow, my friends, 29 Canadians won the Congressional Medal of Honor. I mean, the scale of the war was massive, especially in comparison to the population of the time. But of course, I think you know that the Congressional Medal of Honor is not awarded lightly. It is the equivalent of the Victoria Cross. So the fact that 29 Canadians won that during the war is a testament to not only how many fought, but how seriously and bravely they fought. This guy's bagpipes. my friends, now we're just going to take a look at the third and last segment of another video. I'm just trying to get a sort of a broad sweeping perspective here. I can't obviously spend too much time on it, so this will be short, and then we'll wrap up. So let's get to it.
Martin T. McMahon was a Canadian-born soldier who rose through the ranks during the American Civil War. He was one of only 29 Canadians to receive the Medal of Honor. By the end of the war, he had earned...
So, I mean, you just highlighted that before. One of only 29 Canadians? Come on, that's a lot.
The rank of Major General.
That's
he was
impressive.
one of 40,000 Canadians who fought in the war. Now his name and the names of other Canadians who served are etched into the country's only monument dedicated to the Civil War.
I was just blown away. It's one of those untold stories in Canadian history.
Jim Brownell is the president of the Lost Villages Historical Society in the township of South Stormont, about 15 kilometers west of Cornwall. Brownell didn't know that Canada had played a role in the war.
And he just said before that this is one of the greatest untold stories in Canadian history. So it certainly is in American history, which is not particularly surprising, but is that true? Is this not something that Canadians are widely aware of, and is this not something that is widely taught in Canadian history during school?
Alone that he had family who fought in it.
But that got me into researching, and lo and behold,
7,000 plus
didn't
died,
I
it says on there.
find my grandchildren, Emma and Kate, that their 5 greats in front of grandfather fought in the American Civil War.
It's an authentic reproduction of what was used in the Civil War.
He was approached by Bob McLaughlin of the Greys and Blues of Montreal, a Civil War reenactment group, who wanted to honor the volunteer soldiers.
We discovered, especially with this location here in South Stormont, in the township, that a number of people had, like myself, relatives, either Canadians or Americans, that were involved in the Civil War. And that was the hot button.
That's a very good point, because of course we're looking at Canadians specifically who came down south of the border to fight in the Civil War. But yes, there would have been many relatives of people living in Canada who were Americans who fought in the war, because naturally there is a lot of cross-border relationships. There always has been. And there are a lot of family members who have family on either side of the border, and that continues to this day, of course. So that's an interesting point that I hadn't thought of. I'm also finding it interesting because, you know, these Civil War reenactors or Revolutionary War reenactors, especially the Civil War, are prominent in the United States. They are a very interesting subculture who are very, very passionate about the historical subject matter, and they do these reenactments. I am a little bit surprised to hear that there are groups in Montreal that are doing that, but cool. Okay.
When you have a major war going on next door to you, like here in Lost Villages, you're about 3 kilometers from the border. So Canadians went down. Some of them believed in the cause, some of them went for the money, the excitement, and they joined either one side or the other.
According to Bob McLaughlin, 36,000 Canadian soldiers fought for the Union and 4,000 for the Confederates.
We have 29 Medal of Honor winners, which is equivalent to the Canadian Victoria Cross. There's never been a 3-year time frame where that prestigious medal was won by Canadians.
The wall also lists the names of other notable Canadians like Anderson Ruffin Abbott, Canada's first black surgeon who took care of Lincoln while the president was on his deathbed, and soldiers like Sarah Emma Edmonds, who served in the war by disguising herself as a man.
Wow.
Earlier this...
Okay, before they move on to that subject. Yeah, so that's interesting. You know, when Lincoln was shot in the back of the head, he took hours to die. I think he didn't die until early the next morning, and was attended to by physicians, but couldn't save him. It was inevitable, and they knew it. I guess they just tried to make him comfortable, although he was never ever regained consciousness. I forget who it was. One of the people in his cabinet who was by his bedside said he belongs now to the ages, or something to that effect. But it is interesting to know that, and fitting that one of the doctors who attended to him happened to have been black, considering what the war was about. Yes, states' rights, of course, but the states' rights to own slaves. That's what it was about at its core. All right, and so what I just paused at were people chanting about taking down Confederate monuments down south.
Earlier this year, many cities in the U.S. started to remove statues and monuments from the Confederate side.
And change the flags of certain states that had Confederate battle flags and the Confederate official flag as part of their state flags, or other emblems of the Confederacy as part of their state flags.
But McLaughlin's goal is for this memorial to honor both sides, including the 7,000 Canadians who died.
So it was to recognize the Canadians, not condoning a war of any sort or shape, but just recognizing a gap in Canadian history.
We had a purpose, and that purpose was to recognize a piece of our Canadian history, and that's exactly what we've done here at this site.
Very cool. It's a really cool looking monument also. And boy, if I'm ever up that way, I certainly would like to go see it. Have any of you been there? And what are your thoughts and impressions? I'd also like to know what you knew about this beforehand, and is it, like I asked before, is it something that is widely known or not? Thank you for joining me, my friends, in this very interesting piece of our shared history. And as I said earlier, the U.S. Civil War, of course, had a large impact on Canada. It had to have, just by sheer proximity between us. All right, my friends, I will see you soon, and I thank you so much for joining me. Have a wonderful day. Take care. Enjoy some pictures from our recent trip to the Kennesaw Mountain Battlefield and Museum right outside of Atlanta, Georgia.
So, I mean, kind of counts as exercise, doesn't it?
You can actually still see some of the trenches that the Confederate defenders had dug.